Hello, my name is Whitney Maulsby, and I will be presenting on details surrounding the literature of Benjamin Franklin. Let's begin.
Everywhere and nowhere.
St. Eustatius, Everywhere and Nowhere. O'Malley, page 20. I can't stop thinking about this summarizing statement from Dr. O'Malley's article entitled Franklin's Mail, Gun Trafficking and the Elisions of History. This week, you have been instructed to read pieces of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography in Norton's anthology. After reading Equiano's works last week, we can use information about Old Benji to further discuss the rise of the individual and the employment of institutional structures that help promote the self-made American man. I'm hoping to help summarize some of Dr. O'Malley's strongest points in her article while offering a response to her statements. I'd also love to draw on some connections I have made between what you are reading this week and the article I was instructed to read. Let's discuss a quick summary of Dr. O'Malley's article. In analyzing some of Franklin's strategies in helping to break the colonies away from British control, O'Malley focuses on what she considers a possible 14th colony. She brings up the island of St. Eustatius as a place that provided commercial trading support for American troops. She quotes, "Historians concur that without the island's involvement, the British Army would have easily overtaken the colonists." Why don't we know more about this strong piece of our nation's history? Oftentimes, special tools like this were overlooked in the creation of our nation. However, O'Malley points out that Benjamin Franklin knew the importance of the island, often calling it a part of the, quote, Committee of Secret Correspondence, end quote, and used it for many purposes, including the passage of his own mail through the location to ensure its safety. O'Malley quickly brings up the importance of various writings in initiating the American Revolution. She brings up the novel Israel Potter to address, quote, the rise of the individual as incommensurable with the diffusion of capital and people in the modern age, end quote. Benjamin Franklin also used his writings and his access to print to encourage individualism and democracy. What I find so interesting in O'Malley's article is how she brings together the use of figurative language in Franklin's writings as a parallel to the use of certain tools in winning the American Revolution. Quote, like figurative language, products, in short, shed local concrete associations from their point of origin as they transverse markets, end quote. After a brief summary, I will take a closer look into O'Malley's ideas on Franklin's suggestive use of language. Although it was not acknowledged by many, some saw the importance of the island as a 14th colony because of the free trade it allowed. Only one of two places that didn't have restrictive trading at that time. William Bingham even referred to it as, quote, the greatest mart of commerce in these seas, end quote. Franklin even helped support merchants and sailors in an effort to move gunpowder and weapons through the island. In literature and the spoken word, the name St. Eustatius was oftentimes synonymous with manipulated writings and sketchy military activity. O'Malley writes that many believed that an earlier attack on the island would have been very beneficial in Great Britain's efforts to keep the colonies under its rule. George Rodney, who helped with the eventual fall of the island, stated, that, quote, this rock of only 6 miles in length and 3 in breadth has done England more harm than all the arms of her most potent enemies, and alone supported the infamous American rebellion, end quote. O'Malley also points out that even as Britain was taking possession of the island, they spent too much time persecuting Dutch Jews, giving the Americans more time to achieve victory. What I found very interesting was that the island that was everywhere and nowhere ended up never recovering from British attacks. Very few records of the island's importance in the American War survived. Franklin's involvement in helping Yankee soldiers obtain military weapons during the Revolution was supported by many historians. Franklin himself believed that Britain created more angst with the Americas by increasing trade regulations. While Americans began to understand the importance of establishing their own trade in creating their own nation, Franklin tried to point out that trade was not meant to be an act against or for a particular ruler. O'Malley states, quote, one cannot demonstrate political allegiance simply through the consumptions of goods because this act, in fact, always gestures toward the wider global markets, unquote. Franklin went on to mention that globalized trade should force us to realize that national identity does not exist, but is just a fictional relationship created in order to find the cheapest and most easily obtained consumer goods. Any smart merchant during that time would have taken advantage of the supply problem the war was creating in the world. However, O'Malley points out that in the view of others, many of these lucrative individuals, quote, could not be both honorable and a merchant, end quote. Many individuals stood up for Franklin and those who used St. Eustatius as somewhat of a tool in the war. For example, Silas Deane, who was sent to secure goods for the military, often wrote to prove the legitimacy of trade while, at the same time, helping people like Franklin, quote, smuggle goods for the success of the colonies. As a result of the secrecy about the island's true meaning in the war, Eustatius is almost a forgotten piece of history. Now that I have summarized Dr. O'Malley's article, I want to take a closer look at the parallel she references between Franklin's use of language and the colony's use of St. Eustatius during the time of the American Revolution.
Manipulation of language.
After reading this information, I believe Benjamin Franklin is a master with words. I completely agree with Dr. O'Malley when she states, quote, Franklin was a poet, end quote. The introduction to his autobiography adds, quote, a reading of Franklin's finest prose reveals a multifaceted and agile writer, alert to the best and worst in humankind, including himself, end quote. Franklin's use of metaphoric language, invisible analogies, and sarcasm influenced the thoughts of so many individuals within our society. He, quote, twists the semantics and uses a, quote, manipulation of language to get his point across in the best way he knows how. Dr. O'Malley points out various instances in which Franklin uses his words to mention his influence in the American Revolution, times when he wants to stand out. This reminds me of a moment in his autobiography where he uses a bit of manipulation, this time with his wardrobe and not his words. Quote, he dressed plainly and sometimes carried his own paper in a wheelbarrow through Philadelphia's streets to assure prospective customers that he was hard-working and not above doing things for himself, end quote. However, he also chose to sit back and avoid the spotlight during other important events. O'Malley writes, quote, I maintain that Franklin's sense of when to step forward and when to remain in the shadows was particularly canny. He left many blanks about his life, despite the voluminous number of pages that have been written about him, end quote. I definitely agree that Franklin knew how to use language and literary elements to his advantage. He used an island as a weapon to successfully move needed items to the American army, leading to their success in the war. He found his own way to help his country. Just as we see him as a prime example of the American individual, we also see him blend into the crowd at the right time. I believe St. Eustatius acted in a similar manner in our history as Franklin did. It brings up the question of individuality versus falling in among the crowd. The island represented the individual, but was also able to blend in and disappear when needed. Quote, St. Eustatius, everywhere and nowhere, end quote. What does this mean to you? I'd like to pose a few questions for you when considering your discussion posts this week. First question, how do you think the quote St. Eustatius, everywhere and nowhere from Dr. O'Malley's article relates to Benjamin Franklin's influence on the American Revolution? Question number 2, can you find examples within Benjamin Franklin's autobiography in which he uses figurative language or literary elements to influence his readers? If so, give examples and share your comments. Question number 3. Do you think Dr. O'Malley and I are correct to agree that Franklin is a talented writer, a poet perhaps? Discuss your stance and give examples. Finally, if you have any other points that arise after our comments, please share and discuss.
Thank you for your time, everybody, and I hope you have a great week.